So my name is Keegan Shetland. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Comic-Con Museum. And we're here to talk to you guys today about a kind of an exciting collaboration that we're working on with the Peterson Automotive Museum. They're celebrating their 25th anniversary this year here in LA, and if you haven't been there, it's a really incredible museum, and it just has so many incredible cars represented in its collection, but as seemingly befits a museum located so close to Hollywood, a large number of them are really incredible movie cars. And so earlier this year when Peterson, or earlier last year when Peterson approached us about kind of an ultimate exhibition of movie cars from science fiction and fantasy, we were really interested in helping find a way to put together an exhibit that both car enthusiasts would really enjoy, but also something that fans would really connect with and find some really interesting kind of photo opportunities as well as narrative angles that fans would appreciate. So we're kind of like the Easter egg consultants to some degree on this deal. But I'd like to introduce Brian Stevens, who is actually from the Peterson. And Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what the Peterson specific interest in this exhibit was.
Well, yeah, my name is Brian Stevens. I work at the Peterson Automotive Museum. I'm the exhibitions director, and I've been there about 13 years. Who here is familiar with the museum? Wow, that's actually amazing. It's fantastic. I typically think that people who might live as far away as Orange County might never make it up to see the place, but that's amazing. The Peterson Museum's been around for 25 years, as Keegan mentioned. It's our 20th anniversary. And about a year ago, when we were trying to strategize what we wanted our major signature exhibit for this year to be, one of the things that came up was the idea of returning to our roots. The museum lately has become a very international museum. We're shipping cars from all over the world all the time, not necessarily focused on our original roots. And we thought that this year we wanted to kind of look backward a little bit at the sort of themes that we've addressed, not only as our museum from the beginning, but which Mr. Peterson, that's Robert E. Peterson, has been interested in for decades. He first founded a museum on Hollywood Boulevard called the Motorama Museum in the 1970s, and that was focused in particular on movie cars, Hollywood movie cars. When he eventually in '94 founded the Peterson Museum, one of the big focuses at that time was Hollywood movie cars. And in fact, there's only one theme that has remained consistent through the 25 years of the museum's existence. One gallery that's always been present no matter what else has changed, and that's a gallery devoted to Hollywood movie cars. So we wanted to look back at that heritage and actually take a magnifying glass to it and expand upon it and make something really exciting. We've basically had cars on display continuously for 25 years, but we've never actually done a special exhibition about cars from films. So that's what we're looking to do now.
Thank you, Brian. Next in, we have Michael Klastorin. Those of you who are Back to the Future fans might have Michael's book. He literally wrote the book on Back to the Future, The Ultimate Visual History, and that's the official history of the Back to the Future franchise. But those of you that are out there that are new to this world may not know Michael himself was actually involved as a production publicist on a number of movies, including Back to the Future 2 and 3. Tell us a little bit about your interaction with the Back to the Future family, Michael.
Thank you. I've been around a little longer than 25 years, but about 30 years ago I found myself on the set of Back to the Future 2, which later became Back to the Future 2 and 3. I was hired as the publicist for the movies, and as a result I got to spend every single filming day on both films and become part of that family, and happily we continue, and Back to the Future lives on in many ways, and I'm always happy to be talking about it, and to also sell you my book, which I can do tomorrow if you're so interested. But very happy to be here, and especially excited about the relationship that the Peterson has had with the DeLorean, and the gentleman sitting on the other side of me will be able to talk a little bit more about that.
And there's definitely no one in the room who recognizes Joe, is there?
No.
So Joe is probably the ultimate Back to the Future fan for a number of reasons, not least of which is he's the leader of the DeLorean restoration that restored the Hero A car, the original Back to the Future DeLorean, put the interior and everything back in it. Joe, you actually connected with the movie after seeing it in theaters countless times. And Marty was your age, right?
Yeah, actually, that's true. Did you read that or something?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, I was 16 when Back to the Future came out. 17, whatever. Basically the same age. And like everyone else, it connected with me. I particularly fell in love with the car. And then, years later, I decided that I wanted to try and build my own time machine replica. But those of you who know me know that I don't do anything half-assed. Sorry, kids. They're mine, so it's okay. Sorry, my kids. So I took it to the extreme, like I do everything, and my goal was to build a perfect replica of the DeLorean time machine, and down to the nuts and bolts and everything. Anyway, for those of you who know, it's really hard. It's a lot harder than it looks. But I became known for extreme accuracy, and then I discovered the VA car back on the Universal lot, and it was, kind of in an extremely sad condition, and it had been left outside in the elements for 30 years and become the home to a host of animals and weather, and fans took parts, and they actually, Universal had a Doc Brown character who drove it around the park. So they also had a replica built for that same purpose, and then they kind of lost track of which was the real. In fact, I think they thought it was a replica the whole time. So they had two replicas as far as they knew, and I figured out that it was the real deal, and it wasn't just like I asked if I could restore it, and they said yes. It was a long process of pitching and discussing, and Bob Gale got in on it and weighed in on it, and then I had to first prove that it was the A car. I feel like I'm droning now.
Well, we can
wrap it up. So anyway, I convinced Universal that it was the real car, and then Bob Gale convinced them that I was the guy to restore it. And in a nutshell, that's what I did. So I fixed the A car. It took 2 years, and then if you jump ahead, it went to the Peterson. Which,
we're grateful for that. Since it's arrived, it's easily been the most popular car out of the 150 cars we have on display at any given time.
So this is the perfect segue into the next piece of the discussion. Brian, tell us a little bit more about the Peterson itself and what we can expect to see from this kind of one-of-a-kind exhibit. There's been some interesting vehicles sourced to showcase in the exhibition.
Many.
And
I don't feel like I can talk about them because the more I learn about IP rights, the more I feel like I'm going to get a cease and desist for even mentioning the names of the movies. But yeah, we have a lot of very, very interesting cars that are coming in. One of them that came to mind right now as we're talking about the story behind the DeLorean is we're going to have the original kit from Knight Rider, the very first DA car, which had a very similar story, I believe, even at Universal. It was stored outside, it pretty much rotted away. You saw it, so you know the exact one. One of the kit cars had that story, ended up in the hands of a fan, fully restored, and it'll be among the 42 cars that are on display. Pretty cool.
So let's explore a couple of the others, and
yeah.
I'll go ahead and say the names.
Yep.
Tell us the fun story of how a few of the Mad Max cars are actually en route to LA right now from Australia.
They are en route. Whether they're actually going to make it is another story. Because of customs rules. I've become an expert on customs rules in the last few weeks. Yeah, we've actually been trying to locate the original Mad Max cars for many, many months. Working with KMM, which is the production company down in Australia, through George Miller and the others who worked on the movie. Originally, we didn't even know if they were in Australia. We knew they had gone to Namibia for filming. We thought they might have stayed in Namibia and never returned. After lots and lots of attempts to get through to George Miller and his folks down there, we eventually did. Learned that the cars are in fact in Australia, in a very, very remote town, about 4 or 5 hours outside of Sydney. which thrilled us, and then he came back and said, nope, you can't have them. I think it was too much effort in their mind to go all the way out to this little town to get the cars out of storage, to clean them up and everything like that. But we don't like to take no for an answer, so we made a few phone calls, found a few other individuals in the industry pretty high up at Warner Brothers, ended up with some lawyers who are good friends with the production crew down in Australia, and about 3 weeks ago I got a phone call from George Miller's assistant saying, we've got 2 cars waiting for you. So something worked. I don't know the exact story of what happened to break the logjam, but sure enough, 2 cars were waiting for us. This is the Nux car from Fury Road and the Interceptor from Fury Road as well, which was great news until we looked into what was required to get them to the U.S. and the timing. We mapped it all out with our shipping company and found that there was 1 ship left going from Sydney to California that could possibly take these cars. And the way it all lined up, we had about an 8-hour window where the guys could get to the cars, get them out, prepare them, get them on a truck, get them to Sydney, and get them on this ship. And if anything went wrong, they would not have made it. But as of about 4 days ago, I got a call that they were in a container, they were on the ship, so they're on their way here, which is great because in my mind, the Mad Max series is one of the most iconic uses of automobiles in dystopian filming. So I'm very thrilled about it. However, we just learned today that we might have some customs issues. So we have 5 weeks essentially to resolve some issues with customs and get some EPA and DOT clearances because these are actually drivable vehicles. So they have to be brought in with full EPA and DOT clearance. I'm pretty confident we can pull it off. We've done it before. We'll see what happens.
You might describe the process of putting an exhibit of this scale together as like an exercise in never a dull moment for about 8 months.
Yes, I'm not sure I'm going to survive it. It is an extreme challenge, and really I was joking earlier about intellectual property rights, but the biggest challenge of all is the fact that in our loan agreements with these cars, we technically can't mention they're coming, we can't take pictures of them, we can't use them on social media. In a lot of cases, we can't even allow visitors to take pictures of them. We're trying to work through that and change those aspects of the agreements, but it's essentially you can't do anything whatsoever with any of these cars. The fact that they're even lending them to us, to me, is a miracle, because it seems like that should be prohibited as well. But dealing with that times 40 plus cars, and every single one has its own loan with its own stipulations. It's very, very complicated. And they're also odd cars. It's not like we're borrowing a Corvette. We're borrowing a car that probably doesn't operate. We're borrowing a helicopter, borrowing a whole bunch of just really odd stuff that it's not like you drive it in and park it and it's done.
So there is a kind of an interesting thing coming together as a fixture within the exhibit relative to the 2 Blade Runner movies. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the story that's being told there and maybe some of the cars that are going to be represented in the exhibit?
Yep, Blade Runner obviously was intended to represent Los Angeles. The original Blade Runner was set in Los Angeles in 2019, which is kind of a nice tie-in there. Up there with Mad Max, we kind of look at Blade Runner as one of the most iconic uses of automotive, of visioning the future of the automobile in dystopian science fiction fantasy filmmaking. And so we wanted to really do it right. So we've gone out and pretty much got all the cars from the movies. Unfortunately, the most iconic one of all, the spinner from the original Blade Runner, there are only 2 in existence. One of them's hanging about 60 feet in the air in a museum in Seattle, and they were not going to be able to pull it down from 60 feet in the air. The other one's in Japan, and we weren't able to locate the owner. However, its builder, Gene Winfield, happens to be making one for himself. And as the original builder of the original cars, it's essentially just a third Gene Winfield spinner. So it wasn't screen used, but it's as legitimate and authentic in terms of its origins and its design and the guy who built it. So last I heard, he's close to finishing it up. I really hope that it's true. It supposedly is in Oregon, mostly complete, but I'm really counting on that. We're getting the Deckard sedan, which is coming to us from the Miami or the Florida Police Museum. We are getting it's the taxi, the little yellow taxi from the movie, also an original one. And from the more recent movie, from Blade Runner 2049, the production company Alcon basically said we can have anything we want. Our pick of any car, anyone built for the film. And it turns out they built a whole lot of them in real full scale. I think a lot of them have actually appeared at Comic-Con either during the opening year or since then. Unfortunately, we didn't have room for all of them, so we're going to end up with 2 of them. The spinner used by the character Kay and the spinner used by the character Love. So We also will have a tuk-tuk, which is one of the taxis from Blade Runner 2049 also. Just last week we were out meeting with Sid Mead, the designer of some of the vehicles and also the backdrops from the original movie, and we'll be getting some of his original design drawings from the movie and that kind of thing. So a few small props from Blade Runner 2049, a lot of exciting stuff.
And just to kind of round out a picture of the exhibit as it's coming together, it's not just movie cars, right? Not just movie and TV, there's actually some video game cars.
At this point, I believe we have 2 video games represented. The Warthog from Halo is probably the one that will be the most substantial. It's, I unfortunately just learned 2 days ago, it's a lot bigger than I thought, and it actually doesn't fit into the building. However, we've found there's a way we're going to be able to deflate the tires to get it through a low clearance area. If not, we're in big trouble, because Microsoft has already gone and spent 6 figures building a virtual reality experience around the presence of that car in the exhibit, so wish me luck.
Good luck. So as we're talking about the exhibit, one of the key features, basically one of the first cars you encounter as you move through the space is actually the DeLorean, and it's kind of central to how the whole plan for the exhibit came together. Mm-hmm. And I thought we might get Michael to tell us a little bit about how a DeLorean came to be featured in Back to the Future to begin with, as it's become such an iconic car silhouette.
Well, you know, movie scripts change from the very first one until the final draft that becomes the blueprint for filming. And in the original version of Back to the Future, the very first draft, the time machine was not a car. It was a chamber. It was often referred to as a refrigerator, which had its own connotations. But as the script evolved, they found that they had a problem in that they were wasting too much time putting the time chamber on a truck, driving it here, driving it there, taking it down off the truck, putting it back on the truck. So Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis thought, okay, maybe we need to make this thing a little more mobile. So once they determined that it was going to be a car, then they had to determine what kind of a car it was going to be. And as the roots of Back to the Future began in the early 80s, excuse me, that's when Mr. DeLorean made his big splash with his own futuristic-looking vehicle, which Bob Zemeckis, Bob Gale became very enamored with. They felt it was the absolutely right vehicle to use as the time machine, despite the efforts of a product placement person from Universal Studios who had gone to Bob Gale at one point and said, look, if you use this Ford Mustang, we can get you $75,000 from the Ford company. And $75,000 back in the early 80s was not an insignificant number, and it would have paid for a day or two of filming. But Bob Gale looked at the product placement guy, and he said very plainly, Doc Brown does not drive an effing DeLorean, Ford Mustang. And the DeLorean was in, and that's the way it all started.
So tell us a little bit more about how it's come to be such a symbol. As movie cars go, it's perhaps one of the most iconic, just in general. So it's great to know a little bit more about how it was selected for the role of Back to the Future, but it's become a symbol. It kind of has a meaning inherent in it, and that's something that's kind of shared between a lot of the cars in the exhibit. So maybe if you could shed a little bit of light on how you think that's happened. Even people who don't necessarily know the movie kind of know the time machine, right?
It has. It's become one of the most iconic vehicles, if not the most iconic vehicles known in film. And I think that's part of what made the entire Back to the Future project something that we're still talking about today. It was the perfect storm of a script, of the cast, of the director, of everything that went into the movies. But the DeLorean was the machine that took everyone everywhere. That's how everything started, and that's how everything had to end. So everything was based on that time machine, and the stakes were very high. So when you came out of that movie, whether it be you were talking about Christopher Lloyd or Marty or Biff or whoever, the thing that stuck out first in your mind was that DeLorean, and Doc Brown saying, if you're going to make a time machine out of a car, why not do it with some style? And we recognize that car anywhere around the world at any time.
So Joe, you were part of the movement that built a lot of replica DeLoreans and things like that beforehand. Like you mentioned earlier, you sort of had an emphasis on authenticity. So why don't you take us through the process of restoring this? Tell us a little bit about the state it was in when you found it, and how as a fan you kind of adopted the responsibility of working on the vehicle.
Okay. First of all, I wanted to say, you know, the original Blade Runner spinner made a cameo in Back to the Future Part 2. So there's another tie-in, right?
It all connects.
Yeah. And see, I think the DeLorean time machine was made the impact it made because, well, for a lot of reasons, but because it was so realistic, right? I mean, it looked like something that could work. It wasn't just, you know, a futuristic sci-fi kludged car. Everything on it had a purpose, and the design team, you know, really made the car, you know, a character of its own, gave it life. So when we first got the time machine in our possession, we realized that a year, which is what we had agreed to, was nowhere near enough time, because it was way worse than we thought. You know, the first thing we had to do was clean it because it was gross, and there was a lot of.
Is that a technical term?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it used widely in vehicle restoration?
Gross. We had to take all the panels off and everything, and basically just broom out animal nests and everything. And we didn't want to breathe that either. So, but ultimately, it was two restorations in one, because you know, it's a car and it's a movie prop, and so we had to restore all of the prop elements separately. And before we even started reattaching anything, we had to do a complete DeLorean restoration. So we took it from looking shady to looking the way it did when it rolled off Doc Brown's truck in the first Back to the Future movie. And simultaneously, we, you know, restored all the parts, all the existing parts. You know, half of them were missing, and it was a quest. Luckily, we had a head start on it, being, you know, replica builders, in that we had already invested a ton of time tracking down what all the parts were and discovering them, and we wanted to replace the parts. If we had to replace a part, we wanted to replace it with the real thing, you know, like an actual aerospace part, and not just, you know, some thing we got at Home Depot. So that's what we did.
So some portions of the restoration were more challenging than others. You mentioned having to source aerospace parts that had been used in the original build. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the specific challenges that, you know, that aren't necessarily a bridge that you would cross building a replica, but that for the original car you really did have to kind of try to approach it the way they did build it?
Can you repeat that a little bit?
Sure. So there were some parts of the car that were particularly more challenging than others because
Yeah.
you had to approach them the way that they were done on the movie car, whereas sometimes replica builders kind of shortcut that portion of the build.
I mean, there were no shortcuts, right? And we had to make a lot of really difficult decisions, and basically we had a team of roughly 12 people, and everybody got a vote, about how we should handle each individual thing. And but for an example, there's one part that all replica builders hate, and it's the flux bands, bending those flux bands, because it's not very straightforward. There's a lot of complex curves and some art to it. So we spent a lot of time building the A car. When we got it, the flux bands that were on it were not original. So we had a couple of choices. One was to rebuild them from scratch, and the other was a kind of a Hail Mary at the last minute. We spent a lot of time building the flux bands, and I wasn't happy with them. And then Universal had, in a warehouse, they still had the flux bands from what's called the B car, the one that was hit by the train at the end of part 3. But they had been hit by a train. So I had, brand new flux bands or B car flux bands to try and turn into A car flux bands. And it was like the 11th hour, and we had less than a week left, and I decided I was going to try and use the B car flux bands and rebend them and re-weld them and everything. And that's what I did, and it worked. And I was happier about that because it has some heritage. They were screen-used flux bands are on the A car. Otherwise, they would have been in a bin. That's not good.
So, Michael, there's a kind of an interesting journey that the cars go on, any movie car really, once production finishes. And, there's a kind of a dead space in between the end of production and when you realize, oh my gosh, that's an incredible iconic artifact that needs to be preserved and belongs in a museum. Do you have any ability to shed light on the DeLorean's journey in between the end of filming and when Joe kind of took on the task of restoring it?
Well, the car, along with several others that were used in the production, were basically relegated to the back lot of Universal Studios. So they were under a sort of a shelter, and the tram would drive by, and you would see the DeLorean and Biff's car and this other car, and there would be a sign there saying this was used from Back to the Future, and they basically stayed there. And what you have to remember is that these cars and movie props were not as big a business back then. They were afterthoughts. The studio wasn't sitting there thinking, gosh, what can we do with that now? Let's build a ride. Let's do this, which they did, but they didn't have space to keep everything. If they had kept everything that Universal Pictures had ever put in a movie, that would be the state of California. But, that being said, they still had a few parking spaces left, so they put the DeLorean there, and it was out in the open. And as many people have pointed out, it was subject to bad inclement weather. People would stop by and take a little piece as a souvenir. There's a gentleman that I know who went and snuck into the studio at night, and a friend called him and said, "The keys are in it." I could just drive this out now, but happily he didn't. So it literally just stayed there decaying for decades. And part of what Joe had to contend with was trying to find some of those people who had taken the pieces from the DeLorean to have as a keepsake and try and get it back from them.
Now, Joe, I understand people were willing to return the pieces on occasion to the DeLorean. Can you talk to us about what it was like to have people kind of come out of the woodwork to make pieces available?
Well, before the restoration, there was still this whole kind of culture of replica builders, and so over the years, people had mentioned that they had this part or that part, so it wasn't too hard finding them. Coaxing the parts out of them was a little trickier. But Bob Gale, wrote a letter to the fans and basically, offered everybody kind of amnesty, like, this is what we're trying to accomplish as a community, and if you return the parts, they'll get they got a letter from Bob Gale signed by Christopher Lloyd and Robert Zemeckis, and a place in history, at least appreciated.
That same exact thing happened in recent months in Detroit with the Central Station after Ford bought it. It's probably one of the most iconic buildings in Detroit. It was completely decrepit and abandoned. Then Ford took over and decided they wanted to restore the entire building, which is fantastic news. But more than half of the parts of the building had been stolen. So Ford put out a big, if you stole it, give it back to us. We won't prosecute. And apparently they got the vast majority of the pieces back. It's an interesting way that works.
We didn't get the vast majority back, but we got enough back to make a difference. Some of those parts are, rare, very rare. And in other cases, we were actually able to, retrace the original production team's footsteps and down to finding the box, that had, 2 or 3 of whatever was in it missing, that had obviously gone to those cars originally, because they used really, some old surplus stuff that was, this box is it, and so we were able to put, sister parts back. Ta-da.
The rest is history, as they say. Brian, this is the DeLorean's sort of current state in your Hollywood gallery at the Peterson.
On the picture there, yeah, that's as it sits right now.
Obviously, it's a fitting place for something like the DeLorean to end up. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the Peterson came to basically display the DeLorean and kind of the necessary precautions you take for the long-term care and feeding of these vehicles? Because you kind of have the task of making sure that they're available for future generations to enjoy as well.
Well, the way it came to us, in my understanding, I wasn't actually part of the original acquisition, but it was stored in a location at Universal that was about to be demolished. Did I have that right?
Yep.
And that building was in fact demolished, and Universal found itself with even less space to store cars, such as the DeLorean. And so they looked around for other appropriate places where a car like that might live, and the Peterson was one of the options. And I think we entered in some discussions about as to whether we would want to take the car, to which we immediately said yes.
Discussion. Yeah.
Yes.
And sure.
Yeah, pretty much. And it came to live with us exactly as you see it there, and it's been on continuous display ever since. And honestly, we don't have to do much to it except keep it plugged in. We dust it, the very, very minimal maintenance. But you did well.
Thank you.
Nothing's failed. Nothing's broken.
The electronics was a whole different Megillah.
Oh, I imagine. Yeah, it's amazing to look at if you're at the museum, just staring at the interior alone and all the electronics and everything flashing and illuminated. It's amazing.
Well, in the movie, it was movie magic, right? Mm-hmm. So they would cut and change the date and go back to it and make like, oh, it was working, but nothing worked. It was just on and then cut, and then so when we had the restoration, the one thing I wanted to do was make everything work exactly how it did in the movie, and actually, it can do a lot more than it's doing now.
Can it go through time?
It can.
That was the obvious question. Yes.
I'll tell you. I'll tell you yesterday.
Time travel jokes being thrown out.
So yeah, I mean, that was the thing. We knew it was going to be on display for years and years and years, and it needed to not fail. So the electronics was a lot of work.
Well, so far we've
Still
had not
ticking.
a single issue. Now our Batmobile, I can't say the same for, but the DeLorean's been great. Yeah.
Cool.
So let's kind of take a step back to the exhibit, and you know, it plays a special role, and its placement in the exhibit is very deliberate as being the sort of first car that you encounter.
It's our introductory car.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit about how you kind of use the DeLorean as a device to connect all of these futuristic science fiction and fantasy worlds together to kind of craft a coherent narrative out of that.
Well, among our curatorial staff, everybody has their own reason for justifying that as the introductory car or the featured car or the signature car.
But no one questions whether it should be the introductory car.
No, that's the interesting thing. It is fully justifiable for any of a number of reasons. In my own mind, I think of movies as a thing that going to see a movie is something that anybody can do to transport themselves through time and place. You go and sit down in a movie theater, you suddenly are no longer in the real world. You're in a different time, you're in a different place, and to me, almost symbolically or metaphorically, that's what this machine does. And so I think of that as a symbol of what movies in general do. That's my own personal justification for it, but there are many other ways of looking at why it's sort of it's the most iconic movie car of all, and some people claim it's the most recognized car on the planet, the most recognizable single car on the planet. That alone is a good enough reason to have it be the introductory car. There are many.
Awesome. Well, before we turn it over for a few questions, we should probably give everyone some information. Namely, the exhibition is opening for a preview reception on May 4th of this year, and it will be open to the public from May 5th onwards.
It's actually just changed, important to say. We are expecting so much response to our preview reception that we've made it 2 preview receptions. May 4th and 5th will both be preview receptions, and the open to the public day will be Monday the 6th. It would be, Monday the 6th of May.
Excellent. And we are here on the show floor. You can come and visit us. The Comic-Con Museum's booth is incorporating a couple of automobiles from the Peterson's collection, including a 1989 Batmobile and the 1966 Black Beauty car that was built by George Barris for the Green Hornet. So you're more than welcome to come down and take a look at that. Bruce Lee drove it. It's kind of cool. And if you do that, take a look in the back seat. There's a panel back there for all of the old-fashioned mechanical effects. Like if they wanted brooms to deploy from underneath the tail end of the car to obscure their tracks, Barris actually had to build brooms that deployed from the back of the car that were able to obscure their tracks. So we've been having this question all day, but no, we did not leave a bunch of straw brooms up underneath the back of the car. So we're really excited to have those here. We do have more information on the exhibit available down there, as well as an opportunity for you to swipe your badge for a chance to join us for one of those preview receptions and a curator-led tour of all of the more than 40 iconic cars of science fiction and fantasy that will be featured in the exhibit. This is the only time that they've been assembled this way. So there's
I'm not aware of any other exhibition of its type anywhere in history.
Of its type or scale. So you can go see movie cars in a couple of different
Definitely,
places.
many museums all over the United States.
But this is the first time they've sort of been called back home to LA en masse. So definitely something you won't want to miss. Joe and Michael will also be down in the booth on several intervals throughout the week. Throughout the weekend, rather, and they'll be signing books. And Joe, I think you have hoverboards available?
There are some hoverboards, some skateboards. These are all 30th anniversary limited edition stuff left over from our Back to the Future celebration in 2015. Which brings me to the fact that Michael and I are going to have another big Back to the Future celebration this October. And may involve the Peterson.
Standing.
Maybe.
Pretty much will.
It's a secret,
Sensibly.
It's a secret. Don't tell secrets on the panel, man.
But the car will go through time. Because it does.
Yeah, I mean,
And we should probably let everyone know you guys have a Back to the Future and Back to the Future 2 anniversary panel following this one, yes?
immediately following this,
5:30, room 300D.
yeah, we'll talk about Back
Join
to the
us.
Future too, with our good buddy Dangerous Bob sitting right there.
He's an assistant prop master on all 3 movies, among dozens and dozens of others.
So with that said, we actually do have a couple of minutes for Q&A, even though we started a little bit late, so thank you guys. Let's go ahead and get Dangerous Bob.
Well, thank you. I have a question, and I actually forgot it, but I think other folks would like to hear it. We had one of the cars that we cut the back off of, and did all the insert shots in the dashboard.
Yes.
The top tiers were really running everything. What, I was told that was the B car that rolled back together?
That was the C car.
No.
What happened to that?
The C car was the process car, and that actually sat out after production for a while. Yeah, it was just the front half. Yeah. And then later, it was picked apart and used to create, in conjunction with one of the other off-roaders, right? So there were 2 off-roaders built for part 3 with the white wall tires and the hood box. And one of those is in private hands. The other one also got picked apart and combined with what was left of the C car and became the Universal Japan car. And it was on display in Universal Japan for a long time. So that was kind of both off-roader / C car. And then that was recently auctioned off, and now it's in private hands in Japan. You're welcome.
Right here.
My question is about the DeLorean's journey. There was a recent movie called Ready Player One, and I'm wondering if that was the same DeLorean that was in Back to the Future.
Well, it was meant to be, but it was digital. It was a digital model. However, it was, I'm pretty sure that the Ready Player One people came to Peterson and did some photographing. So, kind of, yes.
That's kind of awesome.
Yeah.
Yes is the
Yes.
answer to that question.
Yes.
Made digital, but yes.
Digitally, yes.
In the green sleeves over here.
I worked on the Batman Returns, and I was able to see the original Batmobile. There was 2 on the set. And I noticed the paint is wrong because it was a much duller black. And I'm wondering, is this a reproduction downstairs? I didn't get a chance to throw it through it.
No, that's one of the studio-produced promotional cars. So you're right, there were 2 originals made in England. I can't remember the name of the studio, but there were 2 originals that were made for filming purposes. And then the studio, I believe, built 3 more for promotional purposes, and we have car 3.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I was also told, it was reading up, and then I wasn't able to sit in it.
Mm-hmm.
But they opened it up out there at the end, and they went to a junkyard, took parts over abandoned Harrier that was in a junkyard, and put them in and give it more.
Yep. There are Harrier components for sure used, or at least design elements used, replicated in the design of the car for sure.
Without wanting to say too much more, there will be another Batmobile present in the exhibit that connects to those first original ones that were built.
Yes, we'll have a representation of,
Yeah.
of another Batmobile. Yes.
Ma'am, I think you had a question right here.
Oh, yeah, Brian.
Yes.
Did you guys run into the original Road Warrior Interceptor? Did the Aussies still have that?
Nope, the original Road Warrior Interceptor is owned by a Mr. Deezer in Florida, who's about to open a new museum in Orlando, Florida, having moved it from Miami to Orlando. And because he's about to incorporate that car in his brand new museum, wasn't particularly excited about giving it up to us. Yes, it would have been a whole lot easier to bring that car over from Florida than to go through what we did to get the Australian ones. But we tried.
But if it had come from Florida, you wouldn't have been able to say you
It would have
scoured
been
the
no
ends
story.
of the earth
Yeah,
to put this
it would have
together.
been no story. Much less exciting.
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah. Question for Brian.
Yep.
Does the museum actively look for cars in this area, like look for the Road Warrior cars? Are there others you were looking for that are missing?
I would say right now, I would say in general, we are not looking for cars of this type. They come to us about as frequently as we can possibly accommodate. We do get calls just about every day from people with things that they want to display, and often they are Hollywood-related vehicles. This is really the only time that we've gone out and actively pursued, and we honestly, our list of pursued vehicles is 149 vehicles long to pare it down to the 41 that we ended up finding. So it was quite an effort.
It started in a really interesting place. A lot of the early searching was kind of like the iconic, you find those lists online where it's like, these are the iconic science fiction cars.
Just about all of them will be there.
A lot of the cars that were on the list, that's kind of where the search started. So finding out what happened to the Lola from THX 1138, destroyed. But, finding out if there were parts of that car were they used to rebuild another car, was there any kind of opportunity to bring that car? It was a pretty exhaustive search, but I will also say an interesting challenge we ran into is that some movie cars are huge. So obviously the conversation took us to the place of, well, obviously we need the tank from the Aliens universe, right? Obviously, the Colonial Marine Transporter. Do you guys know what that is? That's an airplane tug for towing commercial airliners that they put like armor plating on it.
And it's in Europe, so would have been a challenge to get here.
Fitting it in the container and getting it on the ship, potentially problematic.
But the rover from Prometheus did make its way our way, so.
And it is actually there now. If you go to Peterson and you really want a sneak peek, there is a rover from Prometheus in the carport. Yes.
Okay. That was Dean Jeffries, yeah.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
We have Dean Jeffries. There's a trio of Dean, Gene, and George that seem to have, between the three of them, done just about everything. And yeah, I think we all mix them up from time to time.
Yeah, I apologize. That's
yeah.
Right here.
I think we're out of time. We're getting the flags.
All right, last question.
Yes. Are you familiar with artificial intelligence? Yes. There was a quote-unquote helicopter called the amphibcopter. We were just out at the studio today looking at that, assessing how we're going to get it into the museum. So yeah. Yep. That's another example of an oddball one we're bringing in.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Hope you're excited to come see the exhibit.